But first, as important as issues of equality are, and as important as the right to protest is in a free and democratic country like Australia, that right to protest in these times of pandemic must be tempered by the overall risks to all Australians from this virus. Organisers of Sydney's proposed march on Tuesday argue that Black Lives Matter, and by that very fact, their right to march trumps any other public health consideration. I argue this is rubbish, because the laws that put so many of us under restrictions at this time apply equally to all. There's no carve-out based on race. So if Australians can't gather in large numbers for a social, sporting or family-related event, why is it that this march takes precedence? Because as much as the activists say that Black Lives Matter, I would argue here, so too do the lives of older Australians, the vulnerable, people at risk from the highly infectious reach of this virus, even the mental health of people locked up because of these secondary outbreaks. The longer this all goes on, the worse for them, and of course the worse for our economy too. This is about our common humanity now, not about the skin colour of anyone. And the consequences of a large public march in the middle of this pandemic, well, they're not academic anymore, are they? I mean, look at Melbourne. Melbourne was the experiment back in early June, and we can all see what's happening in that state now. Nearly 4,000 active cases in Victoria, 55 deaths. The consequences are real. But this isn't the only complaint I have with these Aboriginal rights activists at this time. Today is a report in the Australian newspaper regarding new Closing the Gap targets the National Cabinet is set to discuss next week. There's been a lot of talk about a new target to reduce the rate of Aboriginal imprisonment, which again is about 8 times the rate for the general population. But unless Aboriginal people are going to get lesser sentences for the same crimes, you can only reduce Aboriginal imprisonment rates if you reduce Aboriginal crime rates. As Warren Mundine, who will later join me tonight, has said in a very powerful essay published last week, setting incarceration targets will see pressure on courts for reduced penalties and pressure on police not to bring charges, even when justified by the severity of the offence. Now, the people working on the Close the Gap targets know this, which is why they've been discussing targets to reduce domestic violence, as well as targets to reduce incarceration. But what greatly concerns me in this same report in the Australian today is that there's now a plan to drop ambitious targets aimed at halving the rates of domestic violence against Indigenous women. Let me say that again. A target is planned to keep Indigenous offenders out of jail, but a target to better protect Indigenous women from crime in the home is shelved. As I see it, the only way you could have a target to reduce incarceration rates without a corresponding target to reduce domestic violence rates would be if offenders mattered more than victims. Is that really what we're trying to say here? As the fearless Jacinta Price has noted, Indigenous children are 5 times more likely than other children to be hospitalised due to an assault. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare says, and I quote, Indigenous females were 34 times as likely to be hospitalised for family violence as non-Indigenous females, 34%. Given this reality, I've got to say that the Black Lives Matter activists would seem more genuine and far less political to me if at least they were just as concerned about all the suffering the black people have experienced, including the present-day epidemic of domestic violence in Indigenous households, as well as all the largely historical suffering at the hands of the system. One of the biggest problems we have in this difficult policy area of closing the gap, as Warren has again recently highlighted, is the lack of a genuine economy beyond welfare and government workers in these communities. And without an economy to sustain the towns where parents have a job and kids go to school, these targets end up being just promises on the never, never. I mean, look at some of the dates set for meeting these targets. Parity by 2060 for incarceration, says the Australian today. 2060? I mean, how serious are we about change? Put these two issues together, and here's what it's important we don't forget. The lives of black women have to matter as much as the lives of black men. And in that, in a pandemic, all lives matter, because more than anything else, we share a common humanity. And anything that doesn't bring us together, regardless of what they say it is, isn't and can't be about equality.